I think we can all agree that the pursuit of wisdom is a good thing. But if we probe a little deeper, we might not actually come to a common understanding about what wisdom even is. Earlier this week when I was preparing for this sermon, I looked it up in Merriam-Webster's dictionary, and there was a whole bunch of different definitions that mean very different sorts of things. So a person can conflate wisdom with knowledge. So for example, we might talk about a scientist expanding human wisdom by uncovering a new understanding of the physical world around us. But is that wisdom? Well, we can look at the story of J. Robert Oppenheimer. In the early 20th century, he was one of the world's preeminent theoretical physicists. His theories led to great understandings in astrophysics and in quantum mechanics. And of course, he's most famous for being the father of the atomic bomb. He led the Manhattan Project that developed the atom bomb during the Second World War. So Oppenheimer was responsible for the production of all sorts of new knowledge, but at the same time, following the war, he was haunted by the possibility that he had opened a Pandora's box that could actually destroy the world in a nuclear holocaust. And so perhaps he wasn't as wise as we might think. Another example of a definition of wisdom can be a person who knows how to employ the skills to get what they want. They know how to get things done. We could look, for example, at a politician who desperately wants to get elected. And so in the campaign, he employs all sorts of wedge issues. He uses rhetoric that's designed to stir up his base and to alienate his opponent's base. And by successfully employing these tactics, maybe voter suppression of the people on the other side, he gets elected to office. So he got what he wanted, but at the same time, the divisiveness of his campaign actually causes harm to the body politic. So can we call this wisdom? I don't think so. Philosophers might talk about wisdom as a way of finding the good life, of cultivating the virtues that are necessary to live the good life. I think this is a little nearer the mark, but at the same time, there is no objective standard of what virtues are required to cultivate the good life, nor even of what would constitute a good life. If I were to survey the philosophers of ancient Confucian cultures and Hindu cultures and ancient Greek philosophers and Enlightenment German philosophers and modern philosophers, they would all probably have a different goal that they're shooting towards. And so there's a limit to human wisdom because it's not objective, it is subjective. And so what I would say is if we look at the Bible and we look at biblical wisdom, it's maybe nearer this last way of looking at wisdom, except that it doesn't decide for itself the virtues and that we need to cultivate, nor the ends to which our lives should be directed. Instead, it submits to the wisdom of God, knowing what it is that life should be directed towards. The thing about biblical wisdom, though, is that it doesn't always look wise to the people of our age who are generally considered the people who can evaluate these sorts of things. Consider what Paul says to the church in Corinth. He says, "The message of the cross is foolish to those who are headed for destruction. But we who are being saved know it is the very power of God. As the scriptures say, I will destroy the wisdom of the wise and discard the intelligence of the intelligent." So where does this leave the philosophers, the scholars, and the world's brilliant debaters? God has made the wisdom of this world look foolish. Since God in his wisdom saw to it that the world would never know him through human wisdom, he has used our foolish preaching to save those who believe. It is foolish to the Jews who ask for a sign from heaven, and it is foolish to the Greeks who seek human wisdom. So when we preach that Christ was crucified, the Jews are offended, and the Gentiles say it's all nonsense. But to those called by God to salvation, both Jews and Gentiles, Christ is the power of God and the wisdom of God. So the idea that God reigns through this weak, crucified man is deeply offensive to human wisdom. Human wisdom looks wise. God's wisdom doesn't look wise. But God's wisdom saves. And so its effects vindicate it. The proof is in the pudding. Wisdom is not validated by how it looks. After all, God's wisdom is revealed in Jesus crucified and risen. And Jesus hanging on the cross doesn't look to an outside observer like wisdom at all. But wisdom is judged by what it accomplishes. And since God saves the entire world through Jesus' sacrifice on the cross, then we can understand that God's wisdom is more powerful, even if it looks foolish to our human eyes. Now, what is God's wisdom? How does it work? God's wisdom is grounded in his love. God is love, John tells us. His heart moves in love towards those that he has created. And so God's desire is to see us all experiencing his, well, the Old Testament word is shalom. And we translate that as peace. But it means more than peace. It can mean wholeness and completeness. I think it's maybe a better translation to say flourishing. Human wisdom isn't primarily concerned with all people. Merely, it is primarily concerned with the benefit of the one who possesses it. Any benefits to others are secondary. But God's wisdom considers the needs of all people. And so it doesn't look wise to our eyes because it doesn't work for the one who possesses it. It doesn't give them a competitive advantage over other people. But Jesus embodies this kind of wisdom, this other-oriented kind of wisdom, by giving himself for our benefit. And his sacrifice makes possible the salvation of the world. As Jesus' followers, we are meant to be a living display of God's wisdom. Our lives are meant to participate in building others up, just as Christ has built us up. James, Jesus' brother, writes very practically to the church this. He says, "If you are wise and understand God's ways, prove it by living an honorable life, doing good works with the humility that comes from wisdom. But if you're bitterly jealous and there is selfish ambition in your heart, don't cover up the truth with boasting and lying. For jealousy and selfishness are not God's kind of wisdom. Such things are earthly, unspiritual, and demonic. For wherever there is jealousy and selfish ambition, there you will find discord and every evil kind of way. But the wisdom from above is first of all pure. It is also peace-loving, gentle at all times, and willing to yield to others. It is full of mercy and the fruit of good deeds. It shows no favoritism and is always sincere. And those who are peacemakers will plant seeds of peace and reap a harvest of righteousness." It seems that there's some sort of conflict in James's community. Maybe there are people coming in and exerting authority over the community, saying that they are wise people and therefore they should be given power. But James is saying that we shouldn't be looking at a person's credentials. What's their education? What letters of recommendation do they have? From what social class do they come? Rather, what James is saying is that we should instead look at the actions of the people and the effects of those actions in judging whether those people actually possess God's wisdom, and then whether or not they are worth following. It's not about looking sophisticated. It's about being the kind of person who makes the place where you are better. Jesus warns us himself, "Beware of false prophets who come disguised as harmless sheep but are really vicious wolves. You can identify them by their fruit, that is, by the way they act." So James tells us to look at the fruit. Does the person's life bear fruit consistent with peace and humility? Probably helpful to ground this in our own experience. So, a story. Let's say that you work in an office with a team. And on that team are many different people, but there are two people who sort of stand out as competing visions of different types of wisdom. The first is Michael. Michael's really good at office politics. It seems like whenever there's good news, Michael is the guy who's right there to tell the boss, and maybe to imply, not so subtly, that he had an outsized influence in doing this good thing. When there is a mistake, when there's a setback, he seems to be absent. He seems to be very good at making sure that it looks like other people are to blame for what happened. He will stab anybody in the back in order to get ahead, and he wants everybody to know just how important he is to the team. Michael's coworkers don't like him very much. His antics breed resentment. On the other hand, there's Jessica. Jessica is a team player. Everything that she does is about making sure that the project gets done to the best of her ability and the ability of the people working around her. When something good happens, she makes sure that the people who were responsible get some credit for it, giving credit where credit is due. When things don't go to plan, she accepts her fair share of the blame. She's not about herself. Instead, everything she does is directed at helping the success of the team. Now, suppose a promotion comes up, and the boss, who doesn't work day to day in the office, and so doesn't have his finger on the pulse of the team, might look at the paper and see Michael as the impressive candidate. But if he were to ask his coworkers, they would undoubtedly say that Jessica was more worthy of the promotion, because Michael doesn't make the place a better place to work. Michael doesn't help achieve the goals of the community, but Jessica sure does. Well, in Jesus' day, there were a lot of Michaels. The Sadducees, this was the aristocratic, priestly caste of Jews, the middlemen between God and sinners who controlled the sacrificial system. The Sadducees wanted adoration from people. They wanted the respect of people. They wanted a seat at the big boys' table with power. They wanted to feel self-righteous, because it's real addictive to look down your noses at other people. And so they were actually very good at getting what they wanted. So they're wise in an earthly sort of way. They're wise pursuing what they want, but the fruit of it is terrible. First of all, they have to cooperate with the Romans to receive all of these things. And yes, Jesus doesn't come to kick the Romans out, but I think Jesus doesn't kick the Romans out because he sees them as an outgrowth of the deeper problem. But that's not Jesus' way of saying, oh, the Romans aren't that bad. The Romans are bad. They're brutal, they're oppressive, they're exploitative. And yet the Sadducees are perfectly willing to cooperate, to go along, to get along. And of course, the Sadducees are the ones who hand Jesus over to be killed Even though God uses Jesus' death for his redemptive purposes, that doesn't negate the fact that the fruit of their wisdom is death. We could compare the Sadducees then to the wisdom displayed by the Apostle Paul following his conversion. In a culture that prizes life being good, that says, hey, if things are going well for you, that's a sign that God loves you, that God is pleased with you, and when things aren't, that's a sign that God is judging you. And so when I look at your life and I see the hard circumstances, I can look down my nose at you and know that you are a bad person. But Paul rejects this whole way of thinking. Paul says, look, if Jesus crucified is our definition of glory, then participating in his suffering is actually the sign of authority and wisdom in God's kingdom. And so rather than downplaying the bad things that happened to him, for Paul, the things that he endures to share the gospel with other people become a badge of honor and wisdom for him. He tells the Corinthian church some of the things that he endured. This litany of offenses is meant to show them that he's the kind of person worth listening to. In 2 Corinthians 11, 24 to 27, he says, 5 different times the Jewish leaders gave me 39 lashes. 3 times I was beaten with rods. Once I was stoned. 3 times I was shipwrecked. Once I spent a whole night and a day adrift at sea. I've traveled on many long journeys. I've faced danger from rivers and from robbers. I've faced dangers from my own people, the Jews, as well as from the Gentiles. I've faced dangers in the city, in the desert, and on the seas. I've faced dangers from men who claim to be believers but are not. I've worked hard and long, endured many sleepless nights. I've been hungry and thirsty and have often gone without food. I've shivered in the cold without enough clothing to keep me warm. But in all this, Paul embodies the wisdom of God because he empties himself in love for the sake of others. So how ought we to display God's wisdom in our lives? Well, I want to go back to the passage that we looked at in James, because James gives us very practical views of the kind of people and the kind of behaviors that we can cultivate that show that we have God's wisdom. The first of these is purity. In the New Testament, purity is about a single-hearted devotion to God that keeps us away from certain types of behaviors that God finds offensive because they injure those whom God loves. And so behaving purely means avoiding things like dishonesty, self-dealing, breaking trust with others, or exploiting others. Another way that we live that cultivates this kind of community is by showing mercy. When others make mistakes, it can be really easy to condemn them because it can make me feel like I'm better. Oh, you think I'm a better person than you because I didn't do that. But a wise community that is grounded in the wisdom of God isn't about condemning other people. Rather, we refuse to condemn. And while we may correct, we only correct out of concern and love for other people, never so that we can feel superior to them. Because we remember that while we were still sinners, Christ died for us. And so we should also delight to show mercy to each other. And when we live in a merciful community, then we can be open and honest about the places where we fail. And this leads us to the next one, to being sincere. We all need to be honest with each other and avoid pretense. Now, I'm not saying that we should not strive to do what is right and to do what is good and to avoid sin. We should all strive to do that with the realization that we are all regularly going to fail. And when we fail, and we live in a merciful and sincere community, then we have security enough to own our failure before each other. And when we do that, we can support one another as we walk through this journey of becoming like Christ. But if we don't, what happens? If we all feel the pressure to adopt the look of a perfect person, well, first of all, we're going to make each other cynical. Or we just think that everybody else is perfect. They've all got their stuff together and I don't. And so I live in fear and I live in falsity because I don't want to be discovered as the one person who doesn't have everything together for fear of being exposed and cast out of the group. God's wisdom means that we should avoid favoritism. This can mean favoritism about groups. So, for example, in the After Party, the video series we've been watching about Christian engagement in politics, they've talked about how we have a tendency to hold the people we agree with politically or those we disagree with to different standards, to a double standard. And so when the person on my side lies, I rationalize it or I minimize it. And when the person who votes the other way lies, well, it becomes the biggest scandal in the history of whatever republic. It's also true that we can tend to use our loyalty to our friends, and that becomes more important to us than our loyalty towards the truth. Do we believe somebody because we like them better than somebody else? Do we believe them because they're rich and the other person is poor? Do we believe them because they're our friend and the other is our enemy? When I was in high school, one of my best friends told me that he had been kicked out of his house by his parents. But his aunt and uncle went to my church, and they told me that actually he had wanted to leave and he had left voluntarily. And I believed my friend because he was my friend. That it felt disloyal to not believe. Until years later, after I considered it, I haven't talked to him in a really long time, but after I considered it, I realized that other things, it probably made more sense that they had asked him to leave, or that he had asked to leave rather than that they had asked to leave them. So I should not have jumped to conclusions because the person that I liked better told me one thing, and the people I trusted less told me something else. And as Christians, we need to pursue peace. Peace in a community is essential for that community to flourish. By peace, I don't talk about the absence of overt conflict, but rather understanding that even conflicts that simmer beneath the surface, resentments that build and are never dealt with, sap a community of its vitality and strength. While the world tells us that we should seek to get our own way, God's wisdom tells us that we should seek the benefit of all. Paul, in his letter to the Philippians, says, "Do not be selfish. Don't try to impress others. Be humble, thinking of others as better than yourselves. Don't look only to your own interests, but take an interest in others too." In our relationships, we need to be accommodating with each other, especially in the places where we have power. When I have power, it's easy to steamroller those over whom I have power. This is the way we're going. I've decided, and we're just going to go that way, and if you don't like it, you're going to have to just suck it up. But that causes resentments to build. Remember that churches can break apart for the most banal reasons. In the 90s, when the worship wars started, churches broke up because some people wanted to use hymn books while other people wanted to use the overhead projector. I've heard about churches that broke up because people disagreed with the color of the paint on the walls. And so if we want to create a community that is at peace, we might need to settle for something that isn't our optimal choice, but that allows everybody to feel that they've been heard and respected. That and the health that it brings to a community is probably more important than me getting what I want on a particular decision, especially if it has nothing to do with the core teaching of the church. So in conclusion, if we want to pursue God's kind of wisdom, we're not always going to look like a winner in the eyes of the world. But if everyone in a community lives by this wisdom, then it will vindicate God's wisdom because of the kind of community and its character that develops. God's wisdom isn't about appearing wise, after all. It's about building flourishing communities. Jesus shows us what this looks like because he accepts the scorn of the cross for the sake of saving those whom he loves. So let us pursue this kind of wisdom, not in self-importance, but the kind of wisdom that seeks the good of those around us, that our lives can be a living showcase of the wisdom of our God.